Good morning, everyone. Are you guys having a good time at the Health Freedom Expo 2019? This is the latest and greatest in science, technology, and human health. This is why we're all here. And I'm proud to present our next speaker, Dr. Ralph W. Moss, whose company, the Moss Reports, from the Quack list to the Nobel Prize. He's a science writer. He has written or edited 12 books and 4 film documentaries on questions relating to cancer research and treatment. He's a graduate of the New York University and a Phi Beta Kappa of Stanford University. Everybody, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ralph W. Moss.
Excited to just speak to you and not to do slides. I think I think it divides people's attention a lot, and you're trying to study slides while you're listening to the person and so forth. So I think because you may not know me and you may not know where I'm coming from, I'll just take a minute to tell you what my background is and how I got into this field 45 years ago. I was hired in June of 1974 as the science writer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, which is the largest private cancer center in the world. And after being there a short while, I went to interview an elderly scientist named Kanematsu Sugiura. And it was really just sort of a puff piece in a way. It was about this wonderful old man who had done so many years, a half a century of cancer research. And in the course of the discussion, the conversation turned to what he was working on currently, because he still showed up every day for his work at the laboratory. And he told me that he was working on Laetrile, a substance, he called it amygdalin. Well, this startled me because in our office we were giving out a so-called fact sheet on Laetrile, and the essence of it was that it didn't work, that it was essentially a quack medicine. We had forms that we would send out to the public if they asked about it, but we got a lot of inquiries in 1974 about this strange apricot kernel extract called amygdalin or Laetrile. So I said to Dr. Sugiura, well, what is there to work on if it's a fraudulent treatment? And he said, well, let me show you something. And he took down his lab notes and showed me that when he administered Laetrile to these animals, the tumors would stop growing in the animals. Sometimes they would shrink a little. Mostly it was the stoppage of the growth. Well, this was my beginning of my career, really, and I didn't know that much about it. I was pretty astonished by this because it contradicted what I was told and what I was telling people. And then he said, but that's nothing. What really matters is this. And he showed me the data that when they gave the Laetrile to these animals that had spontaneous breast tumors, there were metastases, secondary spread to the lungs in 80% or so of the control animals and only 10 to 20% of the treated animals. So it had in animals, in these test animals, it had the capacity to prevent most of the spread of the cancer. And he presented these results to his superiors at the Institute. And I took this news back to my boss, and my boss was like, oh, well, I want you to follow up on this and stay in touch with him and find out how his work is going. Over the next 3 or 4 years, basically what happened was that the results kept coming back more and more positive, and the statements of our leadership at the Institute and the Cancer Center became more and more negative, to finally reach the point where Dr. Chester Stock, who was one of my big bosses, gave a statement to the media saying, we have proved Laetrile negative in all the animal systems we have tested. So at that point, they had tested it in 3 different animal systems, and it had been positive in all 3 of those systems. They came up with one test where it was negative, and I caught the fact that they had administered a 1/40th of the dose that Segura was using, and then they used that underpowered test to claim that it was negative. I myself stopped that from being publicized, and they had to do a further test. But there was fraud at every level of that, except for Dr. Segura and Dr. Lloyd Old, who was the vice president of Sloan Kettering, who was the one who encouraged these tests and just sort of absented himself from anything negative. Finally, it reached a point in November of 1977 that I called a press conference at the New York Hilton Hotel, and I denounced the cover-up of these experiments, and of course was fired on the next day, as the New York Times said, for failing to carry out his most basic job responsibilities. So I guess I didn't understand, taking the job, that when your boss tells you to lie, that's your most basic job responsibility is not to contradict them. But I felt that, human existence, maybe, the lives of millions of people, in a sense, were involved in this. I won't say dependent on it. But I did stand up and promptly got my head cut off and handed to me on a silver platter. So, being then without a job and with $2,000 in the bank, my wife went out and got work, and luckily was able to earn a pretty, a man's salary at that time to support us. And then for the next few years, I worked on my book, The Cancer Industry. And that came out in 1980. I had a great publishing company and a great editor. And so that was how sort of launched my career as a science writer. And I've now written, I think, 14 books, depending on how you count them. I have a new book that I've written that will hopefully be coming out in February of this coming year, called Double Blind, and it's a devastating analysis of the cancer industry. It's sort of the book that I wish I could have written back in 1980 when I wrote The Cancer Industry, but of course things hadn't developed to the extent that they have today. So that's the there's some unbelievably negative news associated with this cancer war. I mean, how much fraud there is in this. It blows my mind. I mean, this was a almost frightening experience for me to write Double Blind, because I had no idea. I knew, of course, I had lived through the fraud of the fake Laetrile testing, which, by the way, reverberates to this day. I don't know if you looked at your news feed this morning, but a man named Jason Vale and his mother were arrested yesterday by federal agents for selling apricot kernels. Yesterday. And he already spent 5 years in prison for that terrible crime of selling apricot kernels. So it goes on. But the good news is, I mean, amidst all these storm clouds, there is sort of some rays of sunlight. And the biggest of all is that immunotherapy, which when I came into the field was actually banned on the same list of quack treatments as Laetrile was. We okay? Okay. That immunotherapy, the use of the unleashing of the immune system against cancer, progressed in the course of my lifetime, my career, from the American Cancer Society Quack list, unproven methods of cancer management, to Jim Allison of MD Anderson Cancer Center winning the Nobel Prize just about a year ago and getting the award in Stockholm. So we've seen this unprecedented, I would say, progression of a field and a development of this. Now, the immune checkpoint inhibitors owe their existence to another treatment and another story. And I wanted to briefly tell you that story because it is something that haunts me, that absolutely I live with this story every day. I think about this every day. It never is really very far from my mind. And so if you bear with me, just listen to these stories because it's a string of incidents that happened. And actually, it started in about in the 1880s. And there was a man, and his name, we know his name was Fred K. Stein. He was a German refugee. And Fred Stein had a cancerous growth on his neck. It was a kind of sarcoma. And he went to the Free Hospital of New York, New York Hospital, which was located sort of in an area on Chambers Street adjacent to the City Hall area. He lived near City Hall in New York City, if you know where that is, downtown. The poor people didn't go uptown to the big fancy New York hospital. They had a clinic of their own. It was like a tenement building, basically. And the good doctors, the compassionate doctors, would treat them there. And there was a doctor by the name of William Tillinghurst Bull, B-U-L-L, who was compassionate, and he treated this man, and he treated him 4 times, but couldn't cure him. And the last time that he treated him, something strange happened, and I'll tell you what it was in a moment. But now, if you go across uptown, there was another doctor, a student of Dr. Bull, named William B. Coley. And William B. Coley was the up-and-coming bone surgeon in New York. And he got, in 1891, he got a patient, a young girl, 18 or 19-year-old, whose name was Bessie Dashiell. And Bessie Dashiell had a sarcoma on her finger. And they brought her to him. He was not even like 30 years old. And they brought her to him, and they analyzed her, and it turned out that this was a very, very aggressive sarcoma of the bone. And he operated on her. He removed her arm, like at the elbow, which is what they were taught to do in those days. And within a few months, the cancer was back. It had spread to her breasts. It had spread basically everywhere, and she died. This was like almost his first patient. So this was a terrible, tragic event, and for everybody concerned. But what made this case unique, was she was the best friend of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was another teenager at that time, a very sensitive teenager. And that brought Rockefeller, the richest people in the world, into contact with William B. Coley. And they had a meeting of the minds. And basically, Rockefeller and Coley decided there's got to be a better way, okay? And Rockefeller supported Coley, gave him moral support and also financial support in different ways. Even when Rockefeller had to go behind the scenes, behind his own medical advisors, he continued to support Coley till Coley died in 1936. So he had some good support behind him. But when he lost Bessie Dashiell, Coley went into the records of New York Hospital, and he looked at other cases, all the other cases of sarcoma that had been treated at New York Hospital. They all, with similar, extent of disease, they all died, every single one, except for one. And that one patient who didn't die was Fred K. Stein. So why didn't Fred K. Stein die? Fred K. Stein, as he was dying, developed a severe infection of the tumor. The tumor itself became engulfed in a disease called erysipelas, which is a strep infection of the skin. We don't see it anymore because it's fairly easily cured with antibiotics. But they discovered that this guy had been dismissed alive from the hospital with no evidence of any cancer. So Coley then went door to door through the slums of the Lower East Side, basically, with a description of Fred K. Stein. He knew what he looked like, and found him. He found him in his own apartment near City Hall in New York and brought him back to New York Hospital to be examined by Dr. Bull. And they took a picture of him at that time, neck clear of cancer. Man was alive and well 7 years after he had cured himself, basically, or Mother Nature, or whatever you want to believe, had cured him of this cancer. And there's a name for that. It's called a spontaneous remission or a spontaneous regression. But Coley, so this has been seen many times. There is actually, if you go to a town in northern Italy, there is a coffin, a glass coffin of a priest who had a spontaneous remission of a growth on his leg, and he sits there to this day, 600 years later, with his gown pulled up so that the world can see this miraculous cure of his cancer. That's St. Peregrine, and he's still there. If you want to go see, people come and they pray to him, and he's actually the patron saint in the Catholic religion of incurable cancer. But Coley was not content with just a religious explanation of what happened to Fred Stein. He wanted to understand how this can happen. What's going on? Where is that force where does this force come from that can take a person who's on their last breath, the last legs of cancer, and turn them into a perfectly well person with some scars on the neck where the cancer used to be? And that's the extent of it. And so he started to do research, and he started to think about this. And being a man of action, he said, why don't we infect some people with why don't we give some people erysipelas? It's a terrible disease, even if a few of them might die, but the point is they're all dying of cancer anyway. Why don't we take a chance on doing this? And Bull agreed with him, and they actually, the hospital wouldn't let them treat them. They actually erected tents. They got a rich person to donate money, and they erected tents to treat people with erysipelas on the grounds of the old Memorial Hospital up on 104th Street and Central Park West. And they also treated people in their own apartments. So that went on for 2 years. 2 years, Coley was treating people with live erysipelas germs. Streptococcus pyogenes is the name of the germ. And they got some remarkable results with this, but there was a problem, which is that it's an infectious organism. And some of the patients, one patient died, and one caregiver came down with a nearly fatal case of erysipelas, so they could not continue with that. So instead, Coley said, why don't we then make up a killed form of the erysipelas germ, of the strep, and we'll inject people with the killed one. And then, because of some technical reasons, they added in another complementary microbe, which is called Serratia marquescens, which is a very interesting, different microbe. And they put the two of those together, and they call that Coley's toxins. The toxins, it's a technical term for a byproduct of a germ, of a microbe. And he had the toxins made up for him over across the street at Cornell Medical College, where he had a connection. And then from 1893 until 1933, for the next 40 years, he gave that treatment to people with cancer. Usually about 2/3 or 3/4 of them were advanced cancers, and some of them were operable cancers where they also gave it in addition to being able to do surgery. The 5-year survival, that's how they measured things in those years. Were you still alive 5 years after getting the treatment? And you probably only had a few weeks or months to live. The 5-year survival rate was slightly over 50% in the incurable, inoperable cases. Over 50%. Now, the vast majority of those people, unfortunately, could not be cured today with using standard methods. So this was I mean, even today, if you had results like that, it would just be astonishing. And given the fact that radiation was still not even invented, not even discovered, radiation, the Curies and Becquerel had not even found it until 1895 when Coley had already been giving his toxins for 2 years, the mixed bacterial vaccine for 2 years, and chemotherapy was more than 50 years away. And they were curing advanced cancers at Memorial Hospital 50 years before chemotherapy was even invented, using the immune system. They didn't know how they were doing it. They didn't have a clue. And in fact, even today, they're not sure. They're not sure how it worked. The fact that it worked is not debatable anymore. This is not debated. You find any textbook you want to open, you'll see the standard formula. William B. Coley used the Coley's toxins in the 1890s and was able to cure some cases of cancer. He's considered the father. Some people say grandfather, some people say godfather, but basically the father of cancer immunotherapy. That's not debatable. So, but it's damning with faint praise. In other words, they will exceed, even though they had him on the Quack list for 10 years, now they will exceed to the fact that Coley cured cancer. But it's like, oh, well, that was then, this is now. And now we've got such wonderful treatments that we don't need Coley's anymore. The fact that they never explored this any further. They were so glad to just bury this away. Well, one person wasn't ready to bury it, and that was his daughter, Helen Coley Nautz. And Helen, whom I knew, she did an amazing thing. From the time he died in 36 until she died in like 2000, she just doggedly pursued this and wrote 18 books, 18 monographs on the Coley treatment of cancer in every aspect and every kind of cancer where it was used, and tabulated the data. And she got every single case that could be humanly discovered. She listed those, the good ones and the bad ones and the mediocre ones. And so we know with great precision two things. We know how many people were cured by the treatment, and more importantly, her fantastic contribution was she figured out with great precision what the conditions were under which the Coley treatment would work and wouldn't work. This is what you need to know, right? So the points where you had to have an active vaccine. That seems to be obvious, right? But Parke-Davis made a vaccine that, as far as we can tell, never cured anybody and was completely inactive. And they sold this for like 30, 40 years. And people, so when we say that 50% of the people were cured, that's including the people who got the Parke-Davis vaccine, which had no activity to it. Secondly, you have to achieve a fever of between 102 and 104. And chills would be good also to get those as well. That's almost indispensable. The difference between the people who get the fever and the people who don't get the fever is an enormous difference in terms of responsiveness, because it is, in effect, a kind of fever therapy. This is natural medicine. This is fever therapy, right? But there may be more to it than that. In other words, the bacteria themselves may have an effect on bacteria within the cancer, because there are bacteria within most cancers. So we don't know. We don't know exactly what part of the Coley's toxins was doing the cure. The third thing is you have to take the vaccine initially every day, and then after that every other day. This is very important. It's not a once and done type of treatment. It's arduous, very arduous to do this. People do it. It has been done. Thousands of people have had this treatment, but it's not easy to do that. You have to have help in doing it, but you basically have to figure on doing it every day for between 4 to 6 months. The very best results were the people who did this for 6 months. There were also very good results in the people who did it for 4 months. As you go lesser periods of time, less frequent administration, you get less robust results. So if you want to have the very best results, you would do this initially every day, then every other day, get a fever and to get to the point where you get a fever and chills for a couple of hours, and then you do that for 4 to 6 months. Those are the people who had the really fantastic results with the treatment. Not everybody could be cured. Helen felt that people who were terminally ill could not be cured. They could be palliated. They had big pain relief, but there is a certain point of no return, at least with the Coley's toxins. We don't know exactly what that point is, but you see people being medevaced into Mexican hospitals. I don't think those people are going to be cured. They might benefit, but they're not going to be cured by this kind of treatment. So here's how the medical establishment deals with this. When I talked to Lloyd Old, the vice president of Sloan Kettering, about this in 1975, Lloyd, who was a wonderful person and a wonderful scientist, Lloyd said to me, well, maybe things of today are not the way they were back in the old days. People are more resistant to fevers and so forth. We really only have to do a clinical trial in order to sort out these issues, to know how the Coley's toxins works, and to basically see how well it performs in an actual clinical trial. That would convince people, right? You know when the clinical trial was published, this Lloyd Old's clinical trial? 2014. It took 40 years to get from Lloyd, the vice president of Sloan Kettering, telling me we have to do the clinical trial, to the actual published results of the clinical trial, which was done in Germany. And here's how they did the trial. They took 12 patients, which would be small even for a phase 1 trial. They took 12 patients. They gave them the Coley's toxins to the point where they had a fever of 100. Remember, it only works between 102 and 104 or 5. And when they got the fever of 100, they gave them Tylenol. All of them. One patient had a remission of his cancer, and then they gave them the treatment at that point 4 times, twice a week for 2 weeks, and then they cut them off. And then they announced, basically, oh, it didn't work. You heard this story before, right? But in a somewhat different context. So where does the Nobel Prize come from? Well, Lloyd Old was the founding scientific director of Cancer Research Institute, Helen Nautz's organization that she founded for exploring her father's work, Cancer Research Institute of New York, it was called. She ran it out of her apartment on Park Avenue. That's where I visited with her after that, in the 70s. So they explored a treatment for cancer. So the current head of the Cancer Research Institute Scientific Board is James P. Allison. James P. Allison is the inventor of immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. He invented the drug Yervoy that you might have heard of, or you might have heard of Keytruda or Opdivo or Tecentriq. This is the hottest thing in oncology by far. Keytruda, the sales of Keytruda last year were $8.8 billion. Billion with a B. $8.8 thousand million, right? And so this is now accepted medicine. This is immune therapy for cancer. The trouble is that 3 things. First of all, it doesn't really work for the majority of patients with cancer. Maybe 12% of cancer patients will get a response with the treatment. Secondly, these drugs are so toxic, especially when given in what I would call high dose, what they call normal dose, that the American Society of Clinical Oncology article/guidebook on the side effects of immune checkpoint drugs runs to 50 pages, 50 dense pages describing virtually anything that could go wrong with the human body should be suspected of being an immune checkpoint adverse event. They call those IRAs, and they can kill you. And something that could start as a cold could then develop into a life-threatening situation. And I mean, maybe 80% of the patients have some side effects with the treatment, but the serious grade 3 and grade 4 side effects are very common with these drugs. That's the second thing. The third thing is the price. The price of a standard course of immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy is $150,000. But when you combine two of the drugs, like they normally do for melanoma, they'll combine Yervoy with Opdivo or Keytruda, the price could go to over $1 million. So sometimes insurance will pay for this, sometimes it won't pay, or you may have a copay. So your copay is going to run you $200,000 just for that. And again, the number of, if you've got melanoma and you're a robust, healthy patient, sure, you know, this is very good. I mean, I did an interview with Jim Allison. It's at my website. I have a YouTube channel, so if you wouldn't mind, if you're interested, please go to the YouTube channel, Moss Reports. And I did a 1-hour interview with Jim Allison, which we just put up this week. And so he gives a convincing argument that in the clinical trials, 60% of the patients with melanoma are having long-term remission on the combination therapy. So yeah, it's great. But when you get to the other kinds of cancer, and if you're not that ideal patient that's basically accepted into the clinical trials with all the criteria they have for admission, you may not respond quite as well. And then, of course, the price of it, they call this financial toxicity of the drugs, is enormous. And most of the people of the world cannot afford this. I mean, that's self-evident, right? But even in a relatively wealthy country like Chile, only 10% of the people are covered or could afford that treatment. And there's 100 countries in the world poorer than Chile. So this is an elite treatment. It's only really available to people in rich countries with good health insurance or wealthy individuals. Coley's toxins are being supplied to some clinics in different places. The lifetime course, the 6-month course of Coley's toxin, with the profit of the manufacturer built in, is about $2,500. So you're talking about a $2,500 treatment versus at minimum $150,000 treatment, and the drugs are sold by the milligram. These are among the most expensive, valuable properties on Earth. I mean, by weight, they're like 5,000 times the weight in gold. It's something, you know, I figured it out once, something like that. So and they're patented. Coley's is not really patent. It's not patentable. People can patent their way of using Coley's, but essentially it's about we're talking about 1,000 or 5,000 to 1 difference in terms of the price of the drug. So this is immunotherapy. It's an important advance. Jim Allison deserved the Nobel Prize for making this discovery. He found some very important things out about how the immune system relates to and interacts with the tumor, because those two entities are talking to each other all the time. You may think that this is just like some sort of medieval battle, where you've got your immune system on one horse and your cancer's coming down on the other horse and they're going to try to knock each other off. It isn't like that at all. There's an interaction between the immune system and the cancer, and it's complicated. And he discovered that there was a mechanism by which the cancer can shut off the immune system. So even if you take mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, the cancer can still come in and say, no, I'm going to shut down your immune response. Coley's toxins probably is so powerful that it just overwhelms, as my way I visualize this, it just sort of floods the system, overwhelms the cancer's defenses, and maybe does many other things as well. But so that's it. And I asked Jim Allison, you'll see this at the beginning of my interview with him on my YouTube channel. So now explain to me how your work relates to William B. Coley's work. He had the barest, most elementary understanding of who Coley was, what he did, what he accomplished. He didn't even recognize the name Helen Coley Nortz, he said, I think I met her sister or something. That was his response. The man won the Nobel Prize for the discoveries in cancer immunotherapy. You now, all of you, even if you slept through half of my lecture, you now know more than the last year's Nobel Prize laureate in cancer immunotherapy about Coley's toxin, without a doubt. Without a doubt. How can this be? I mean, it's like a crazy world we live. Yes?
He deserved the Nobel Prize.
Yes, he deserved it. Well, first of all, to me it's wonderful. I've been, yelling myself hoarse about this topic for 45 years, so now I don't have to say, and this was, this was, somebody back in 1936 said that Coley was a genius. Now, I don't have to go much further than say, but Jim Allison won the Nobel Prize, so I like it. But yes, the understanding of that corner of the cancer immune puzzle, that alone, even if he had never thought up Yervoy, which he did, which was brilliant in its own right, and there are doctors, a few, who are using low doses of immune checkpoint inhibitors, like Ralph Kleef in Vienna, or Mark Rosenberg in Boca Raton, who can use these drugs in a low enough dose that they cause many fewer side effects. And the drugs, this is an important aspect, which is the crosstalk between the cancer and the immune cell, and specifically, how does the cancer shut down the immune system? But of course, this is an old idea. This can be traced back to 1916. I won't go into that story, but there were scientists in Vienna, Austria, in the period before the First World War, who postulated the existence and crudely isolated factors in the blood that shut off the immune system. This has been known for 100 years, and some of you may remember the name Lawrence Burton, who ran away from the United States in the 1970s, persecuted by the powers that be, and he was talking about blocking factors and deblocking factors. And Burton went to the Bahamas and had a clinic there for the next 30-odd years, giving people deblocking factors for cancer. So I'm not saying that Jim Allison stole this, because I don't think Jim Allison has a clue as to the existence of these things. But when I quizzed him about tumor necrosis factor, removing the blocking factors to TNF, which is what Rigdon Lentz in Preenon Kimsey does in Germany, he didn't seem to have any point of reference there at all. So I'd be the last person on earth to say that Jim Allison, ever stole a nickel from anybody. But he's retreading over ground that pioneers of natural medicine and of more, let's say, simpler, more humane forms of treatment pioneered. And he's the beneficiary of their work, even if he himself doesn't understand that he is. There is a continuity between what these ancestors suffered, because most of them suffered greatly for persisting with treatments against the wishes of the medical profession or the scientific community or clique or whatever you want to call it. So I think this is not new, but it's phrased in terms that any modern scientist can understand. And that has advanced immunotherapy into the fourth leg of the table. The table stood for a long time with surgery, radiation, chemo, and there was debate, well, what's going to be the fourth leg of the table, or the fourth pillar, as Jim Allison calls it? There's no debate anymore. It is immunotherapy. And that rests on the work of William B. Coley. But it rests on the work of William B. Coley, but you can't get back to the work of William B. You can't even find it. And this is truly the hardest part of this whole story. Is you might be interested in this, and you're going to go and say, Ralph Moss told me about Helen Coley Nortz's monographs. There are these monographs. I have a copy. Don't ask me to lend to you. She gave me a full set and I look at them literally every day. I more than look at them. I look in them. some of these books, only 2 copies exist in the world. Only 2 copies. The National Library of Medicine has a copy. Maybe one university library might have a copy. They've disappeared. And I've written to Cancer Research Institute, which is now still a very big organization that controls her estate and her copyrights. No answer from them. Why don't you reprint her monographs? Well, all right, maybe they just were too busy raising money to, respond to little old me. But I could give you another conspiratorial explanation. They don't mind holding up the picture of William B. Coley and saying, this is our founder, But if you get into the monographs of Helen, you immediately will discover what the treatment actually achieved and what the conditions are for achieving that with tremendous precision. The woman spent half a century, and she was brilliant, she spent half a century documenting this down to, the most minuscule detail. And I think I won't accuse them because I don't know what their motivations are, but I could certainly imagine that a lot of people don't want you to see that data because you might get ideas. And you might get the idea that you deserve that treatment, or at least that the world deserves a proper clinical trial of that. And that's something that I don't know we'll ever see. We need a tremendous shakeup of the medical system. Actually, we need a tremendous shakeup of the whole society, because it goes back to, It goes back to the bribery of the medical profession, and especially the oncology profession, by Big Pharma. This is the root of all of our problems. The fact that there is such a thing as lobbying, where pharma, when there was a bill before Congress recently to basically weaken the FDA's power to demand actual proof of life extension from a treatment, Big Pharma fielded lobbyists to go into Congress, the 500 whatever members of Congress, and lobby them to pass this bill that would weaken FDA's authority and also do many other things that were beyond even mentioning now, basically robbing the public to do their work for them. So let me see somebody volunteer. How many lobbyists do you think pharma sent to Congress to achieve this? Any ideas?
200?
How many? Say it again. 200. 500. Okay. 13,500. 13,500 lobbyists. Every congressperson was hit simultaneously with 500 lobbyists or something. And many of these lobbyists, they worked for Congress. They were Congress people, senators. The head of pharma for many years was a former senator, U.S. senator. And the amount of money, you can look at open data, it's a government website, and you'll see how much money the oncologists get from the different pharmaceutical companies. Take one case, Jose Baselga, who was physician-in-chief at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I cite this case because it was on the front page of the New York Times. This was sort of the test case. Jose Baselga, who got caught promoting a drug ridiculously, a cancer drug, and the next day the pharmaceutical company Roche pulled the drug and every other drug like it. It was such a flop. That drug was such a flop, but he didn't get the memo. And he was going on promoting this drug, and everybody was going, what's with Jose? Where's this coming from? Jose always wrote in all his papers, no conflict of interest. So it turns out Jose Baselga he got $3.3 million personally in his pocket from Roche, one of the 3 biggest cancer drug makers, personally $3.3 million from that one company. And he got fired, basically were forced to resign, and then wound up as the head of research and development for AstraZeneca, another huge drug. So at least he's out in the open now, right? That's going on everywhere in cancer. The top the most important authors of the most important papers are on the take. They're on the take. They're getting tens, hundreds, or thousands of dollars or millions of dollars that we know about because this is at a government, it's coming from a government website that's part of the Affordable Care Act. It was enacted. It's everywhere. I can't find a clinical trial of a new cancer drug that isn't riddled through with conflict of interest. I live in Maine, and I was called to jury duty a couple of months ago, and it was a pretty big panel of people, and we were sitting in the courtroom, and you've probably all gone through this, right? And the judge comes in and starts quizzing us about potential conflicts of interest. What are our attitudes about this? Would you convict somebody if this? 6 hours this went on. 6 hours to quiz a panel, and the guys were accused of illegally baiting, giving poison donuts to bears in the Maine woods. This is kind of high crime in Maine, So I was thinking to myself, they dismissed a woman because she had babysat for one of the defendants 25 years ago. She babysat for this guy. That's enough to get her kicked. Do you know that the clinical trials that we all rely upon, that our doctors are telling us, here, take this particular drug, that clinical trial was, of course, paid for by the company that makes the drug. They write the paper for the doctors. They have professional science writers, medical writers working in their employ. They get the first crack at interpreting the data. And then, check this out, the first author, the second author, the corresponding author, sometimes those are the same people, and the last author. The last author is very important in any scientific paper. That's usually the senior person. They don't need the credit anymore. They're fostering the careers of their protégés. It's almost impossible to find one who isn't taking huge amounts of money from the pharma in general and from the particular company that they're working. So imagine if this judge in Maine came in and he was quizzing all these people, but he was on the slide taking, $50,000 from one of the plaintiffs in the case. I mean, this guy would be hung from a lamppost. But in clinical trials, this is perfectly okay. As long as you admit your sin is forgiven. And everything is, everywhere you look, the FDA is riddled through with conflict. And the revolving door, half the FDA employees are going to work for the company that they were judging, and vice versa. They come back. And you know what? You double your salary. I figured this out. From an FDA analyst to a lobbyist for pharma. Literally overnight you will double your salary by going over to pharma. So this is the problem. I don't know how we're ever going to solve this problem and get to the testing of drugs in a way that's objective, that we could say, yes, I believe I believe these results because these people were honest and capable and unbiased, and they went where and you'll find a few. There are a few people who you look them up. There's no conflict, or maybe they took $27 for a lunch or something, which is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about payments, chunks, $30, $40, $50, $100,000 flowing from companies into the pockets. And again, I'm not here talking about research funds. You might think, oh, well, look, they got to do their research, so naturally they took the research. I understand that. I'm not going to argue about that right now. I'm talking about money to pay the kids' college tuition, money to buy the boat, money for the mortgage on the second house. That's what I'm talking about. It's so pervasive that you need a revolution, really, in order to change that. This can't be changed piecemeal. It really is going to take some very, very big national upheaval. That's why I wrote this new book, Double Blind, because I want to give people at least the basis of understanding what's happening. Okay, well, thank you all very much.